Press TV's headlines: austerity anger grips the streets of major European capitals. The U.S. continues to press Pakistan to reopen the NATO supply route to Afghanistan. Also reports that Saudi Arabia is planning to annex Bahrain under the pretext of forming a confederation. Good morning, everybody. 3:30 here in the capital of Tehran. You've joined us on another edition of Press TV's World News. Many thanks for joining us in our lead story. Anti-capitalism and austerity protesters have rallied across Europe, calling for an end to what they call predatory capitalism. The protests were mostly peaceful, but in London, they turned violent. Protesters joined the global Occupy movement's day of action in Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, and Hungary. The biggest demonstration was held in the crisis-hit Spain. At least 100,000 so-called indignant protesters marched in some 80 countries across the country. In Germany, demonstrators symbolically slaughtered the sculpture of the stock market bull in front of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange.
That was a symbolic slaughtering of the bull in front of the stock exchange, which aims to show us that we as citizens have the power to slaughter this bull if we just all stick together.
Demonstrators are outraged at their government's mishandling of the economy and tough austerity measures. They believe cost-cutting moves take their toll on ordinary people. Here's more on that story.
The sight of hundreds of protesters and hundreds of tents became a part of the London landscape last year as the Occupy movement reached Britain. After many a court battle, they were finally evicted at the end of February. But for one unusually sunny day in London, they've returned. The Occupy movement is back at St Paul's to mark another day of global action taking place in hundreds of cities across the world. Last year, this movement changed political dialogue. Now even the politicians use terms like the 1%. Now they're demanding a change in action, not just words. Speakers said the world has changed since they first came to St Paul's, and that in no time in history have so many people in so many countries stood together.
It was a global movement ever since it happened, when it started in the Arab Spring, and then it spread it across the world. It then went to Spain, then Wall Street, then London, and ever since then, I think we're all connected, working together in networks.
People found their own unique ways of getting their message across. This protester pretended to talk on behalf of the banks.
You cannot achieve anything by demonstrating like this. I recommend go home, keep shopping, keep the economy going. Okay, there may be cuts. You may have to pay with your taxes for the bailouts, but that's not a reason to cause trouble.
It was said in jest, but had a serious message. The Occupy movement highlights that people are fed up with the banks, with the politicians, and with the way the media covers their actions.
90% of the media, the mainstream media, is actually owned by 6 conglomerates. People aren't stupid, but we live in a very dumbed-down society where the truth isn't actually readily available. We only get a certain amount of what they want us to hear.
From St Paul's, the protesters moved on to 49 targets on their Meet the 1% map. All are implicated in some way to the financial crisis. First stop was Goldman Sachs. Other targets included the Royal Bank of Scotland and Number 10. This protest may have seen less numbers than last year, but it was much better organised and showed that the Occupy movement is far from over. Nargis Moualleri, Press TV, London.
Well, for more on our lead story, we're joined by Guy Hetchko with Press TV correspondent joining us from Madrid. Guy, demonstrators are outraged at their government's mishandling of the economy and, of course, tough austerity measures. However, Spain is at over almost 24-25% unemployment rate. What at this point are the people wanting their government to do?
Well, I think the main concern of people is they would like certainly people protesting today in Madrid and around Spain, they would like their government to focus less on austerity and more on growth. I think they feel that the unemployment rate, which as you pointed out is nearly 25%, is unacceptable, and that should be the priority for the government at the moment, and getting the country out of recession, rather than making the meeting of deficit targets set by the EU a priority. At the moment, the government seems to be focusing on the latter with its programme of cuts and austerity. And I think people don't, a lot of people aren't convinced when the government says it has to cut the deficit first to build up confidence in the Spanish economy before it can focus quite so much on growth.
Well, Guy, as IMF chief Christine Lagarde has mentioned, austerity measures prevent growth. So what is a win-win situation where the government can do to promote growth and try to have austerity measures to prevent their debt to increase?
Well, that's a very difficult one, and that's the ultimate conundrum at the moment for the Spanish government, for so many governments. It's something that a lot of economists are saying at the moment is that perhaps the government could do more to get banks lending, because that's a big issue in the Spanish economy at the moment. Besides the unemployment issue itself and the recession, money's not flowing around the economy the way it should be. And perhaps if banks were encouraged to lend to people, lend to businesses, that might encourage businesses to start hiring more people, and then you see the unemployment rate go up. But it's a kind of a vicious cycle, and at the moment there doesn't seem any way out of it. And I think the government's trying to find the right formula, but it's not convincing a lot of Spaniards at the moment.
Very well, thank you for that. Guy Hetchko, Press TV correspondent, joining us from Madrid. All major left-wing parties have called the umpteenth demonstration against Prime Minister Mario Monti's emergency government on Saturday. From north to south, Italians from all political convictions are warning Monti's executive that it is going too far with its tough anti-crisis measures. Press TV's Mac Civilli tells us more.
Over 20,000 people gathered in Rome on Saturday for a new protest against the Monti-led government. The demonstration was called by the left-wing federation, which includes the Communist Refoundation Party and the Party of Italian Communists. Italian media have labeled them neo-communists. They fiercely oppose the abolition of the Article 18 of the Workers' Statute and to Monti's reforms in general.
Monti's cabinet says it is a technocratic government, but the truth is that it is undoubtedly a political government, a government that applies right-wing policies, strong with the weak and weak with the strong.
Monti must leave as soon as possible. His recessive policies are unfair and unsustainable as they hit the working class only. Italy is full of desperate people. All left-wing parties must unite in view of new elections. We demand new elections.
CGIL, the major Italian trade union, announced on Saturday that over 320 million hours of wages guarantee fund have been authorized since January this year. At this rate, 1 billion hours look likely for 2012. A total of 470,000 workers on 0 hours have suffered a 1.2 billion euro loss of wages in the first 4 months of this year, equivalent to 2,600 euro per employee. Pressure on Italians grows by the day. The overhaul of the pension system, the imposition of new taxes, and the reform of the labour market, which will make it easier to fire workers. Many Italians are suffocating under the weight of Monti's reforms. Social tension is mounting in Italy, and some fear a return of terrorism. A Molotov cocktail was thrown against the headquarters of tax collector Equitalia on Saturday, while 2 explosive devices were found and disarmed in Rome. The Interior Minister has said that the level of alert in the country is high.
Those who link social tension with terrorism lack common sense and are almost criminal. The social malaise is definitely there, but terrorism is an enemy of the working class.
This government is against the Italian people. It's just a government of big business and the international banks. Italians cannot stand the situation any longer.
On Friday, FAI, an anarchist group that has recently targeted Italy's tax collector Equitalia, claimed responsibility for kneecapping the CEO of a nuclear engineering firm. FAI said it would continue to carry out other actions. The shadow of the infamous Years of Lead is still hovering on Italy. Max Civili, Press TV, Rome.
Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets in major cities in protest against high cost of living and social inequality. The largest rally took place in Tel Aviv, with some 5,000 people gathered at central Rabin Square. Some of the protesters called for the departure of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The demonstrators accused Netanyahu, of failing to reduce the social gaps. Similar rallies were also held in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Haifa, Eilat, and other major Israeli cities. The protesters are seeking to relaunch a protest movement that swept Israel last summer. In the northeastern U.S. state of Maine, people have taken to the streets to protest Washington's latest education cuts. The protesters carried placards that called for more education instead of wars. Took part in the protests were teachers and students. The protest comes after U.S. lawmakers okayed billions of dollars in cuts to social programs, including education, to protect the military. They have voted to cut over $310 billion in social government spending just to spare the military from a budget cut. Millions of Americans depend on the social programs to get by. The top U.S. commander in Afghanistan has met with Pakistan's army chief to discuss improving border coordination. The meeting comes almost 6 months after American airstrikes killed 24 Pakistani soldiers along the Afghan-Pakistani border. U.S. General John Allen met with Pakistani Army Chief General Ashfaq Parvez in a bid to reopen supply routes for U.S.-led forces. Islamabad closed the land route in Afghanistan after the deadly incident. U.S. forces now use an alternative shipping route through Central Asia, which is considerably more costly. Islamabad has been demanding a formal apology for the attack and a stop to covert U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan. Washington has not apologized and says it has no intention of stopping the drone strikes anytime soon. Well, for more on this story with Pakistan, we're joined by Gareth Porter, investigative journalist. Mr. Porter, thank you for joining us on World News. Now, we know this alternative route that the U.S. is using is more costly and not as beneficial to them. How is it that the U.S. Is continuing in this situation with NATO as desperate to get the transportation route going for its supplies to Afghanistan?
I think there are a couple of things that help to explain this pattern of behavior on the part of the United States. One, of course, is that there was a great deal of overconfidence on the part of the U.S. military and the national security team of President Obama last year when the United States military in Afghanistan carried out this operation into Pakistan and killed some 26 Pakistani soldiers in 2 border posts. I wrote about that incident later after the report was filed after the investigation and pointed out that the U.S. military had never apologized for the fact that the attack on those 2 border posts went on for almost an hour, despite the fact that the report showed that the United States command in Afghanistan was aware that they were attacking Pakistani border posts. And so there was plenty of reason to apologize, but they didn't. And I think it's now clear that they believed that the Pakistani government and military would cave in and agree to reopen the border, the access routes into Afghanistan after a few weeks. They were sadly mistaken, and I think what they failed to understand was, and this is the second point I think that really explains this situation, the Pakistani population is so strongly opposed to concessions to the United States, certainly without the United States basically giving its saying that it apologizes for this incident, and therefore the Pakistani government is not free to make a deal such as the United States would like.
Now, Mr. Porter, in your opinion, with the tense situation the U.S. and Pakistan has currently, Pakistani authorities say they are not happy with U.S. drone strikes in their country, but U.S. authorities have said that these statements are for domestic consumption. Who is doing what regarding drone attacks, and who are these real targets?
Well, I'm glad you've raised that question, because the U.S. and other world media have systematically misreported this question of the policy of the Pakistani government and particularly the Pakistani military leadership on the question of drone strikes. It is true that earlier on, particularly during the Musharraf regime, but even after Musharraf, the Pakistani military was willingly going along with and indeed supporting U.S. drone strikes privately, while officially they were going through the motions of protesting. But at some point, and I would pinpoint this in 2010, roughly sometime in 2010, the United States really changed the targeting of its drone strikes in Pakistan and began to overwhelmingly target the forces fighting in Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban, and their allies, the Haqqani group, and really de-emphasized al-Qaeda and the people who they had been targeting previously. And it was at that point that the Pakistani military decided that this was really not in their interest. In fact, this was something that was profoundly against the security interests of Pakistan. And so since then, they have very strongly opposed the drone strikes and put pressure on the United States to end the present pattern of drone strikes and to adopt a very different policy.
And Mr. Porter, finally, if you can briefly explain to us their beliefs that the main headache of U.S. policymakers regarding Pakistan is its nukes. Therefore, its engagement on war on terror is only a cover. How would you explain that situation?
Well, I would not argue that the United States is engaged in Pakistan primarily because of the desire to get a hold of nuclear weapons, if that's what you're referring to. I think the overwhelming motivation of the U.S. military and the Obama administration more generally for continuing to put pressure on the Pakistani military and government is the war in Afghanistan and the fact that the Pakistani government refuses to go along with U.S. policy of targeting the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani group for the simple reason that these forces actually are aligned with Pakistani security interests as viewed by the security elite in Pakistan. And this is a fundamental disconnect between the interests of the two countries. And I think it is now basically too late for the United States to put pressure effectively on Pakistan to get them to change their policy.
Very well. Thank you for that. Gareth Porter, investigative journalist, joining us on Press TV's World News. Continue with the rest of your international headlines. The number of fatalities among U.S.-led forces in Afghanistan has surpassed 3,000 since the start of the war back in 2001. The website icasualties.org that keeps record of the number of U.S.-led forces casualties in Afghanistan says almost two-thirds of the fatalities were American. It also says the U.S. has lost 1,968 soldiers in the war. This year alone, more than 100 U.S. soldiers have been killed in Afghanistan. Roadside bombings have been number one killer of U.S.-led forces, causing almost half of the total casualties. Insecurity continues to rise across Afghanistan, despite the presence of about 130,000 foreign forces. Growing military casualties in Afghanistan has intensified opposition in the United States against a protracted war. Now over to Bahrain, where dozens have been injured and many arrested as Saudi-backed forces intensify their crackdown on anti-regime protesters. The latest round of violence took place in the capital Manama and several villages across the country, including Bilad al-Qadim al-Sahla. Saudi-backed forces fired tear gas and rubber bullets at crowds of anti-regime protesters who had come out to call for the downfall of the regime. The demonstrators also demanded the immediate release of prominent human rights activist Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja and other political prisoners. The Persian Gulf nation has been hit by a wave of anti-regime protests since February of 2011. Scores of people have been killed and many more wounded in the regime's brutal crackdown.